Well, we've reached our final panel, and everyone has been very good. And I think from my point of view, it's been a really excellent event. So thank you, Tim, again. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Laura, Ben Smithwick, Rowena, all for helping to make this just a wonderful event. Our last session is on probably the most topical issue of the day, the homeless situation, and we have a wonderful panel which Kerry will introduce. Kerry Jackson is a senior fellow at Pacific Research Institute. He spent several years at Investors Business Daily. That's how we got to know Kerry, and when investors had a change in plans, we were able, fortunately, to bring Kerry on as a senior fellow, and he is an incredible writer of fabulous articles on the homeless, on AB5, on all kinds of things. So he is working on our big study on the homeless situation. So last fall, we put together a small 7 or 8 page briefing paper, which was presented to San Francisco Mayor London Breed's administration. We're not sure, where that is right now, but I guess London Breed's in a bit of trouble with some issues in the last, I read in the paper on the weekend, so we'll see how that all pans out. But we are doing a lot of work on the homeless situation, and we're going to release our major study later this year, which will look at what are the issues, and we're coming up with solutions to the homeless problem, and it's not just about pouring and putting more money from the government into various plans that have not worked. So we're very excited about this, but I'm also very excited about this panel, and I would like to turn it over to Kerry.
Thank you, Sally. This is the second panel that Dr. Wayne Winegarden was supposed to be on today, but he is ill and could not make it. So once again, we have Tim, who has called himself the Tony Danza of the day, I believe. So he's going to fill in for Wayne once again.
Well, I only had to come up to the stage 2 times today, so I guess I'm not exactly Tony Danza. But fortunately, Wayne sent us his presentation, so I'm going to be a reasonable facsimile of him. So we can still hear his perspective, even though he's sick in bed 3,000 miles away. If you want to follow along with Wayne's presentation, there's a copy of the PowerPoint in your gift bags as well. So Wayne's perspective on homelessness is naturally an economic one, given his status as, our economist. And Wayne argues that the numbers present a very disturbing trend for homelessness in California. So Wayne looks at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development figures, and he notes that America's homeless population overall declined by 10% between 2014 and 2019. Yet in California, it grew by nearly 33% in the same period. So in raw numbers, that's nearly 20,000 more homeless people on the streets. And if you drill down a little further, nearly 60% of this growth is concentrated in greater Los Angeles. If you look a little outward, 80% of the growth in homelessness in California is really concentrated in 4 areas. And that would be Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco, and the Oakland-Berkeley area. Now, what are some of the causes that exacerbated homelessness and California's homeless crisis since 2014? For starters, it is the decline in housing affordability in the state over this period. Wayne points to some figures showing that if you look at median home prices relative to median household income, you'll see that those have been growing since the housing crash in 2008 and 2009. But it's also a problem for renters, too. Nearly 54% of renters are actually paying more than 30% of their income toward rent. And the sort of rule of thumb is that you shouldn't pay more than about 28% of your gross income toward housing costs. So Wayne actually puts it bluntly. A household in California would have to earn nearly $125,000 annually just to afford the median home price. And that's actually 77% higher than California's actual median household income. And these high costs don't stop at housing. If you look at cost of living overall, California, compared to other states, ranks 50th, dead last for the cost of living. And this is everything. It's housing, it's groceries, it's utilities, it's transportation, it's everything that we pay for in the cost of living in our daily lives. Now, the problem is even worse when you consider the state's overall poverty problem. So Wayne explores figures from the supplemental poverty measure from the U.S. Census Bureau, which most consider to be a more accurate reflection of true poverty. And if you look between 2016 and 2018, California averaged 18.1% on this supplemental poverty measure. So in human terms, that's 7.1 million people in California who are living in poverty. So the key takeaway from this is that poverty in California is actually being made worse by the state's high cost of living. So Wayne explores some anecdotal evidence where he finds there's a causal relationship between high costs of living and poverty and homelessness in California. He cites a recent New York Times article that detailed the results of a survey on homelessness of the actual homeless in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And they found that more than half of the homeless surveyed, in Los Angeles in particular, said that economic hardship was the primary reason they fell into homelessness. In San Francisco in particular, 26% said that it was the loss of a job that propelled them into homelessness. And 23% said that they lost their housing for the first time in 2018 and were experiencing homelessness for the first time. Wayne also cites as further evidence a Los Angeles Times article, and it makes the case that of the roughly 59,000 homeless residents in Los Angeles, they largely became homeless because wages didn't rise with the increase in rents, and these rents rose significantly, of course, due to the lack of housing supply. So as is the usual case with economics, it's basic supply and demand. So now that Wayne has set forth kind of the economic case and the economic numbers, what can we do about homelessness from an economic perspective? So Wayne offers several suggestions, which naturally starts with housing. He cites a recent report from the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and it simulates what would happen if the 11 metropolitan areas in the United States that had the strictest housing regulations on the books reformed those or wiped a lot of those away. And this report found that getting rid of these policies and paving the way to build more supply could actually reduce homelessness by over half in San Francisco and by about 40% in Los Angeles. Now, when you think about it, that figure right there is the real tragedy of California's homeless crisis. You know, our high costs of living and general unaffordability is not something that happened by circumstance. It was a policy choice made by the folks at the state capitol across the street here and in city halls across the state. So we're seeing this unaffordability that's exacerbated with excessive government review of housing projects, the phenomenon that we read about of, not in my backyard or NIMBY groups that really twist the existing law to thwart the construction of badly needed new housing across the state. The abuse of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office says delays housing projects by 2.5 years on average. And then a host of local growth controls that restrict home building and limit density. But as we saw with this stat about California leading the nation in cost of living, it's not housing that is solely to blame for unaffordability crisis. It's also well-intentioned government energy mandates. And these include California-only fuel standards and solar panel requirements for new buildings and renewable energy mandates that sound great in theory, but they actually drive up the cost of energy use, and they increase the prices for the goods and services that we all consume. And it contributes to what we term energy poverty, or spending more than 10% of your income on energy costs. Also adding to this problem, as we discussed earlier with our panel on entrepreneurship, are government mandates that take away opportunities to get a job or increase your income. And when we hear about policies like AB 5 and $15 minimum wage increases, these all lead to higher costs and more unemployment. So if we're going to get serious about reducing homelessness from an economic perspective, Wayne argues one of the most important things we can do is to address this unaffordability crisis. So he outlines a few reforms that he would suggest to increase housing affordability. And he would start by reforming the Environmental Quality Act, deregulating zoning, and streamlining the government review process. Because as he notes, each of these policies adds significant expense and delay to home building. And they actually make it unprofitable for some to build new housing at all. And then next, Wayne recommends that we focus on addressing energy poverty by reforming or repealing these renewable energy mandates and cap and trade and fuel mandates. Because remember, collectively, these policies increase energy costs on the poorest Californians who are barely surviving. And remember, these are the people that so many in this building across the street claim to champion. Finally, Wayne recommends that we reduce the mandates that we talked about earlier on businesses so that more companies will be able to expand and hire those who are out of work and boost salaries for their current employees. And this includes AB 5, making it so that, and minimum wage increase, that all of these collectively drive up business costs and unemployment and reduce job opportunities and the ability for individuals to earn more money and earn money on the side. So with that, I'm giving myself the hook. And I'll sit down now so we can hear what our real experts here have to say. So thank you so much.
Thanks again, Tim. Next speaker is Christopher Rufo. He's an adjunct fellow at PRI. He is a filmmaker, writer, and policy researcher. He has directed 4 films for PBS, Netflix, and international television. His latest film, America Lost, tells a story of 3 forgotten American cities. He is also the director of the Discovery Institute's Center on Wealth and Poverty and a contributing editor at City Journal, where he covers poverty, homelessness, addiction, crime, and other afflictions. And if anybody hasn't read his work at City Journal, they should do themselves a favor and check that out. He graduated magna cum laude from Georgetown University, was a Claremont Institute Lincoln Fellow, and has appeared on NPR, CNN, ABC, CBS, HLN is Headline News, and Fox News. Chris Rufo.
Great. Well, thank you guys for sticking it out. Get some coffee if you haven't forgotten. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how I see the homelessness crisis. This is something I've been studying for the past 2 years. And I just spent a week on Skid Row in LA looking at it really from the inside out, not from a statistical point of view, but from a human point of view. And I think it's important as you think about this, there's a prevailing narrative here in California, in Oregon and in Washington, where the crisis is the most acute. The prevailing narrative, you've probably heard it, goes something like this. In the advanced stage of capitalism, corporations, tech companies, and landlords have created vast levels of inequality, forcing working class people onto the streets. You've heard that before? Okay. I don't think I need to explain to you why that's not true from an economic perspective. But I think, as most of you, I think, are right of center in this room, we tend to look at economics exclusively as the explanatory mechanism for social problems. I think with homelessness, it's important to look at economics as the context, but actually social and cultural problems as the content. So, of course, if you look at rents in Sacramento, in San Francisco, in Seattle, Washington, where I live, they've gone up very quickly and they've become very expensive, kind of superstar cities, San Francisco included, Los Angeles. But if you look into the details of people who are on the streets, I think it's important to separate out economic causes from social causes and separate out people who are sheltered, homeless, people who have gone through hard times, had a job loss, a medical emergency, domestic violence, that are otherwise functional, need a little bit of economic help getting back on their feet. This is a group of people that is relatively easy to provide shelter for and transition out into other housing over time. There's a second group, though, that really undercuts the dominant progressive narrative and creates a lot of complex questions on solutions. That's the unsheltered homeless. So this is really the group of people that are creating public disorder, that are creating citywide problems in places. And in places like the Tenderloin in San Francisco, Skid Row, you have really kind of normless zones that are lawless, that are the haven for crime, for drugs, gangs, prostitution, violence, and they become the de facto dumping ground for the most vulnerable people in society. And the narrative has been that these are economic problems and people falling on hard times. It cuts against the public perception that there are really two main drivers of what puts people out on the streets, literally on the streets, in tents, cars, and cardboard boxes. And those would be addiction and mental illness. And it's become really a taboo to even say those things. Homelessness, addiction, and mental illness in the same sentence is a taboo. And I know when I started reporting on this, looking at data, looking at a big body of social science evidence dating back to the 1990s and really trying to convey this story, I was attacked relentlessly by almost everyone. You're not allowed to say it. In Seattle, for example, the mayor of Seattle says only 20% of people who are homeless have an addiction. If you look at the Los Angeles mayor, Eric Garcetti, he has a website where he lists the 6 main causes of homelessness. Addiction is not even on his list. But I've done some reporting starting last year that suggests, conservatively as it turns out, maybe half of the homeless population suffers from an addiction based on some lawsuits in King County and some evidence from law enforcement. But the LA Times did a really groundbreaking study where they reanalyzed all of the data from the point-in-time homeless surveys. And they found, along with the California Policy Lab at UCLA, other researchers that are saying our existing model about economic hard times isn't holding up, doesn't match with the obvious experience that you see on the street. They found that 75 to 78% of the people who are unsheltered have an addiction, a serious mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or both. If you look at San Francisco, the Department of Public Health just put out some statistics, and I did a public records request to get the real detailed numbers. The city of San Francisco, which is really a small city geographically, has 4,000 people who fall under what's called the perilous trifecta. People who are simultaneously homeless, have a serious addiction to methamphetamine or heroin, and have diagnosed psychoses. So again, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other psychotic symptoms. There are 4,000 of those people on the streets of San Francisco right now. This isn't a problem that can simply be solved by building subsidized apartments, which in Los Angeles are now costing up to $700,000 per one-bedroom unit. So you have policymakers that have really kind of doubled down on this idea that homelessness is a housing problem and propose multi-billion-dollar solutions to construct housing. The problem, however, is that homelessness is a housing problem in context, but in content, it's a human problem. You can put someone who has a methamphetamine addiction, is in and out of jail, has schizophrenia, totally disconnected from family, unable to work. You can put them in a unit of subsidized housing. And you can say, we've solved the homelessness problem. But my contention is that you have to address the human problems to truly solve this problem. And it's actually negligent and cruel to just assume you can get people off the streets and into housing and your job's done. So the next thing, the solution that is really dominant in the state legislatures and city mayors and conferences, even at the federal level, although it's changing in the last year, is housing first. Anyone ever heard of housing first? Yeah. Sounds great, right? It's a great slogan. I'll give them that. Housing first, that's great. Well, you know, the question that I think it begs is housing first and then what? You build housing and you still have these really concentrated pathologies and human challenges. So here's the problem with housing first. It's basically been touted as evidence-based, data-driven, kind of the social scientific solution, right? And so far it's been pretty much unchallenged. There hasn't been really any work that really challenges the housing first dogma in a rigorous and substantive way. So in the last couple months, I went through and I read almost every study on housing first since the 1990s to the present. It's actually a very small body of research literature. A large percentage is published by people who have a vested financial interest in housing first developments and programs. And beyond that, it's really been captured by people who are ideologically invested in essentially more centralized control over the problem. And the literature, even on its own terms, is actually quite interesting. It shows one thing that they like to tout as the solution is they say, well, if you put someone in a housing first environment, again, this is a housing plus a team of experts, psychologists, psychiatrists, rehabilitation specialists, case managers, housing supervisors, a whole team of experts, like an 18-person assertive community treatment team in some places. After 1 year, 80% of people are retained in housing. That sounds pretty good. But if you think about it, if you give someone free housing, is 80% really that surprising that they're going to stay in free housing? So I think it's, on its own terms, not as good as it claims. But the really devastating part of housing first, in my view, is that if you look at below those top lines of housing retention, which is the only statistic people talk about, if you look at, even on their own terms, even kind of assuming that there's no biases or problems with the methodologies and the research, housing first, in the vast majority of studies, does not reduce psychiatric symptoms and does not reduce substance abuse. And in some studies, it actually increases substance abuse use and increases psychiatric symptoms and distress. There was a recent study of housing first in Ottawa, Canada, that had a two-part study. They said, we're going to put the A group, the test group, into a housing first with all of these resources. The B group is the control group, where there's no intervention, meaning we're going to leave the B group on the street and do nothing and track their results simultaneously to see what results come from housing first. Which group do you think fared better? Yeah. So the first group, again, they had better housing retention rates because they're given housing. But actually the B group, with no intervention, people who were literally left on the streets, showed greater progress on psychiatric symptoms, substance abuse reduction, and community and family relationships, and self-reported well-being. The A group that was given housing first, in this study, again, a small sample size, was 5 times more likely to die in that year alone. So it really challenges these fundamental assumptions. Like in Los Angeles, they're doing essentially the biggest housing first experiment in American history. They've devoted $1.2 billion in taxpayer money to build subsidized apartments. There's 2 problems. One, as many of you probably could guess, the public sector is notoriously inefficient at doing things, including building apartments. They said we're going to build 10,000 units. Within 3 years, they had built 0, and they had reduced their expectations to between 4,000 and 5,000. So they had reduced off the top immediately, said, well, we're going to fall at least 50 to 60% short of our goal. Again, unit cost for studio and 1-bedroom apartments range from $400,000 to $700,000 a unit. And in some cases, greater than the median cost of the average single-family home in Los Angeles County. So from a public finance perspective, the auditor wrote a blistering report that was a lot of fun to read. And he basically said, what the hell is happening? And he found that 11% of it, people say, well, high land costs in Los Angeles, right? No, it was about 11% of the total budget went to land acquisition. And 40% of the budgets were lost in regulatory compliance, lawyers, and consultants. 40%, if you project it outwards, of more than $1 billion is getting sucked into a soft cost system of regulatory compliance, consultants, lawyers, finance folks. So from a public finance perspective, it's very inefficient. But even more important, when you have 60,000 people that are on the streets right now in Los Angeles County, and you can say we're going to build 5,000 units over 10 years, what about the other 55,000 people? And even for the people who get into housing, there's no guarantee that they're going to actually improve the quality of their lives. So I think it's important for all of us and for this project that we're working on together to really dig into it and create a counter narrative. And I think that speaks to a couple elements. What is compassion? Compassion isn't locking someone up in a subsidized apartment and waiting for them to die. Compassion is actually dealing with those human challenges and setting a goal of transformation of the human life. It's about dignity. There's nothing dignified about what's happening in places like the Tenderloin or Skid Row or Pioneer Square in Seattle. And I think that has to be a central component of public policy. And third, we have to also acknowledge that there are other models that are developing in all three of these states. Unfortunately, despite some valiant efforts from some folks, there doesn't seem to be a clear path forward for some of the biggest cities in the West Coast in the immediate term, the immediate future. But what I've documented is that there are small and mid-sized cities in all three states that are saying, I'm looking at what Seattle's doing, what San Francisco's doing, what LA's doing. That doesn't seem to be working. Let's try another way. And I think that it can be boiled down into a philosophy that I've kind of called compassionate enforcement. Leading with services, leading with the offer of help, leading with something that could actually make a difference, but also enforcing norms, enforcing responsibility. Because the fact is, a city like Los Angeles, 22,000 people in LA County became homeless somewhere outside of LA County and then migrated into LA County. 22,000 people. Essentially, they've imported a small city of people from around the state and around the country who have come with tremendous challenges. Smaller cities are doing something different. They're saying we're going to enforce the law in a compassionate way. We're going to lead with services, but you can't create public disorder, and we're not going to allow the kind of collapse of a sense of law and order, norms, and human dignity. And in the packet, you have a kind of guidelines that I've written, sharing it with mayors, police chiefs, city councils, human services managers across the West Coast to try to chart a different way forward. And I think it's a very complex problem. That's true. Everyone agrees on that. But I think that we need to be rigorous and sophisticated in how we talk about it, how we deal with it, and don't fall for the narrative that they're peddling that's going to cost a lot of money, and the problem's only going to be worse in 10 years. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. And now we have Joseph Tartakovky. He is also PRI adjunct fellow. He's a former Deputy Solicitor General of Nevada. He currently practices appellate and constitutional law at Gibson Dunn and Crutcher in San Francisco. He's author of The Lies of the Constitution, 10 Exceptional Minds That Shaped America's Supreme Law. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Los Angeles Times, among other news outlets. Joseph?
Well, hello, everybody. Hanging in there? This is a beautiful setting for a conference. I mean, these are blocking the windows, but it feels like Davos. I mean, I've never been there personally, but I imagine it looks as equally dramatic. And it's an auspicious day to talk about the subject because just hours ago, the governor gave a State of the State speech devoted mostly to homeless. I had a chance to read it. I'm actually surprised that he didn't wait for this panel to hear from me and Christopher before he gave the speech, but you should have it. Let me tell you quickly how I came to this issue. I grew up in San Francisco, where it's always been an issue. I remember in high school, a bunch of students in my class had this. They started this program to give food to homeless individuals, and then one of the students got attacked by one of the individuals, and they call off the program. I remember studying for the bar exam, trying to study for the bar exam in the libraries, but they become unusable because they become shelters. And most recently, I was part of a team representing the city of Boise, Idaho, in a lawsuit that we tried to take to the U.S. Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit, which is the federal court of appeals for the western states, held, and it was the first court, it is the first court to do so, that a city cannot enforce its laws against camping, meaning sleeping on the streets, unless it has shelter for that person. Now, the practical result of that is to make it impossible to enforce your anti-camping laws, and that's what's happening as we speak in hundreds of cities across the West. It's created quite a crisis. So I've been drawn into the legal side of the homelessness problem. And actually, sad to say, it's for someone from San Francisco, it's becoming a generational problem. I have a 5.5-year-old, and the other day she was on a field trip, and the class got scared by some homeless individual ranting in the park, and she came home. She was shaken by it, and she said, "Well, my teacher said that the man was sick." And I said, "Well, Margot, what does that mean to you?" And she said, "Well, it means when there's something wrong in your head and it makes you say mean things." I mean, for all I know, that's the same guy that I had to see when I was in high school. So it is a problem. But let me first say this. The governor described it as the issue of our time. In many ways, it's more acute than it's ever been, but I think it's important to remember that this has been an issue, a human issue, as Christopher put it, since before the founding. And why this is important is that I think actually we set ourselves up for failure if we talk about finding a solution to this problem. It is, you can't solve it any more than you can solve poverty or drugs. You can manage it. And it's demoralizing when politicians talk about, this is it, we're going to solve this problem now, and they don't do it. There are things in Gavin Newsom's speech today that I have seen in speeches that he gave in 2004 or 2003 when he was the mayor of San Francisco. It's been going on for a long time. I found a newspaper from 1734 in New York City saying that, complaining about how there are beggarly people wandering the streets and calling for some sort of public building to house them. After the Civil War, Americans learned about this. They were called vagrants, sturdy beggars in the founding era, colonial era. After the Civil War, they became tramps and bums, newly empowered by the railroads that crisscrossed the country. In the 20th century, hobos, okies, drifters, loafers. Americans, for most of our history, have felt contempt towards these people, and the law reflected that. The law was harsh. The only safety net we've had for these individuals for most of our history has been their friends, families, or church. The only service that most cities have offered was the service of showing the homeless man where the city limits were and maybe a kick in their behind. There's a case from the Supreme Court in 1837. New York City had passed a law that said that if you as a ship captain bring an individual into the city and that individual can't support themselves, they become a public charge, you as the ship captain have to reimburse the city of New York City. The Supreme Court said, perfectly constitutional, and the Supreme Court said that the moral pestilence of paupers, and that was another word for homeless people in that age, was as dangerous as physical pestilence, like the plague. But something has happened, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years. There's been a shift in our attitudes, and this is coming to be reflected in our law. The castigation and contempt of the old days has given way to sympathy and to support. Californians want to help these people. We used to have things like workhouses. This is you get a bed and you get meals, but you got to chop wood and you got to break rocks. We used to have tramp rooms. These were essentially police station, your jail cells without a door. You could stay there for the night and then move on. This model is a relic. Now we have, as Christopher was describing, the new model, wraparound service shelters, or they call them navigation centers. I mean, amply financed buildings with professional staffs, social workers, nurses, vocational counselors, drug counselors on staff to try to help these people get on track. We don't just have scattered soup kitchens. Cities spend billions of dollars to help people, and it's an important thing that we should recognize. William Graham Sumner, who was the sort of most famous professor of the late 19th century, said that the man in the gutter is just where he ought to be. Now, we don't talk like that anymore, but more importantly, we don't think like that anymore. The flip side of all this is that people like you all here, you want answers. I mean, we know that we're spending billions of dollars trying all these different strategies, talking about this issue now for decades, and it's not working. The solutions, there are many of them, and we can discuss them. The answer is sort of, it's everything. You need to build housing, sure. Temporary shelters. Some cities are putting up essentially airplane hangars so at least you're in a warm, safe place. It's a little bit easier to move on with your life. Sites where you can camp. You can't camp in the commercial district, residential districts, but you can camp in this particular area, a zone that's set aside. And above all, my view is that the key is connecting people to services. So there should be a sort of taxonomy. People are homeless for different reasons. The guy that fell behind on his rent check and is now on the street, those people, according to some studies, are off the street within a matter of months. They're motivated. They just need help. There's a separate but and a very small class of people. They're sort of, rebellion, wanderlust. They're people that could work but are choosing to live on the streets for a period. In Silicon Valley, there's a profile I saw on PBS. There's a software engineer who lives in a van, and he makes $200,000 a year. But he works at one of these tech companies where you get 3 meals a day. There's a gym, you can shower. So it's just a sort of financial decision. So those types of people, that's easily dealt with. When we talk about the homelessness crisis, we are talking about the people that are afflicted with drugs and mental illness. These are the people that are causing all the disturbances on the street. These are the people that are scaring children. These are the people that make it hard for mothers to take their kids to playground. These are the people that scare away all the tourists in conventions in San Francisco. These are the people that utilize the emergency services and police calls. Now this group of people, however they fell into homelessness, whether because they lost a job or lost housing, what's keeping them in it? And as Christopher said, there's a debate. It's like a parlor game. Do you think it's 20%, 50%? I'm sure that in the Tenderloin, it's upwards of 90% in San Francisco. They cannot get out unless they get services, meaning mental health counseling and drug counseling. If you take a mentally ill person and put him in housing, you have a mentally ill person in a room. And if you have a drug user and they're in given supportive housing, you have a drug user that continues to use drugs in the privacy of their own home. The minute you take away that support, they're back on the street. The one thing that's very different about homelessness between now and the last 300 years is the power of the drugs. So you could have a hobo jungle, that's what they called them around 1890, of essentially encampment, people cooking, cleaning their foods, drinking, but they didn't have fentanyl and methamphetamines. Fentanyl, which is a synthetic opiate, is 50 times more potent than heroin. A pinch of it would kill any one of us in this room. That's how powerful this is. You have to use it every few hours to avoid withdrawal. If you are addicted to fentanyl, you are not getting off the street unless you have drug intervention. And I think it's important to recognize that. Let me just say one more thing, and I'll stop, and we can continue the conversation. The one trend, actually, let me add one thing about the drug thing. about Christopher mentioning that there's no one talks about the drug thing. It's very weird. It's very weird to me. I glanced over the governor's speech, and I copied and pasted it, and I did a word search for the word drugs. It's used twice in a 3,000-word speech, and not connected to sort of, he mentions, this guy was addicted to drugs, but nothing about drug counseling. It's very weird. I don't understand it. A lot of talk about housing. And by the way, careful on this housing thing, because you'll notice that if you pay attention and you look carefully, these policies are often sort of two-faced. They say, oh, we want to cut the red tape, build more housing. Okay, good. We also want reduced barriers to entry. We also want rent control. Well, that makes it hard to build housing. That disincentivizes building housing. I know a developer in San Francisco. So in San Francisco, you can't build. And then they say, well, where's all the housing? Well, what did you think was going to happen? So the people that do build, it's a lot of luxury condos, because that's what you need to build if you want to recover your costs. And so the city mandates you have to have 20% affordable housing. So what this looks like in practice is you are taking someone who could not afford to live in one of these luxury condos and you put them in the apartment. And it's very hard on the developers, because these people pay $5,000 a month for a one-bedroom unit. And then the front desk of this complex is getting calls. We're hearing music at all hours of the night, people screaming. There's water dripping down from my roof. The fire department has to come break down the door. They're selling drugs out of this. I mean, it's a mistake, and the city officials are very confused about it. One San Francisco city official asked the developers, when someone moves out of the apartment before someone else moves in, could the homeless individuals just live there for like 2 days before the new people come in? I mean, why not do that at the Hyatt Regency? I mean, like when there has like a day of vacancy, just put it. This is forcing private businesses to subsidize the problem even more than they already do. Let me make one last point. There's a dangerous trend that was not in Newsom's speech, but I want to alert you to it. And this is what I've seen as a lawyer. And this is the trend of recourse to the courts as a means of salvation. We've seen this in other areas of life, educational law being preeminent. The case that I litigated, Martin, is a sign of this. This was the argument the court accepted was an argument that activists had made for decades and had been rejected for decades. Essentially, that you have to build housing for people, or you just have to let it all go. I mean, you just can't do a thing about it on the streets. These are constitutional decisions, sweeping constitutional decisions on these very complex matters. The thing about constitutional decisions is that if the Constitution speaks on it, you don't get to. It's no longer a matter for county boards and city councils. It's been removed from the democratic realm and all the flexibility and democracy that entails. It ties the hands of local governments at the very moment they need it most. The dissenters in the case said, well, so the reasoning of the decision was it's unfair to punish someone for doing something that they can't help. In this case, sleeping on the street. If they have no place to go, you should punish them for doing that. Now, there's some problems with that premise. We won't get into it. But one of the dissenters said, well, sleep is not the only thing that you need to do if you are living on the street. And they said, what about, like, relieving yourself? And this was sort of a scary hypothetical to show the bad logic of the decisions. Well, just 2 weeks ago, a federal judge in Sacramento, a few blocks from here, said, actually, I think that's right. Constitution says you can't enforce anti-urination laws in public if they have no place to go. Sacramento was going to remove a porta potty. The court said, well, if you're going to remove the porta potty, you can do that if you want. But if they can't use that and they can't get into restaurants, then hands off when it comes to self-elimination. That's the word the court used. So this is a weird thing, and it's a scary thing. It's going to be a big problem. And with that, thank you very much, and I look forward. and let's continue this conversation. I want to hear what you all have to say.
I'm sure we have a lot of questions now from these two panelists.
Yeah, two quick questions. One is, what do you think about as former Assemblyman Mike Gatto's idea to have a homeless court. There are a few of them already in some counties. And the second's related. I've talked to rescue mission officials who said that with Prop 47, it's really hard to have any sort of means to force them into those homeless courts, which are designed to get people to services rather than to put them in, incarcerate them.
So I think that Mike Gatto's proposal, it's called the Compassion Intervention Act, is a very smart thing. Now what this is they're called community courts. They have different names, different places. This started in Manhattan, and it's called the Midtown Community Court. The idea was that for certain low-level, nonviolent nuisance crimes, graffiti, loitering, prostitution, maybe low-level theft, instead of sending them into the criminal justice system, take them to these courts where you have a judge, and the sentence, instead of 30 days in jail, is drug treatment, or vocational training, or picking up trash, something more useful. I think this is, and then Gavin Newsom went to New York, saw this. He started there's one in San Francisco. I think this makes a lot of sense. I used to be in law enforcement, and I can tell you, someone steals a bottle of perfume to feed a drug habit, and you put them in jail for 30 days. 30 days later, they're right back where they started. It doesn't do anything. And so if you want to have a chance at being at least partially effective, I think these community courts are a good thing. This is avoiding. There's a slogan about criminalization of homelessness. Now, there's a place for law enforcement, but jails are very bad places for mentally ill people. And I used to work. I remember officers telling us, Capitol in Carson City, this was like the worst thing they had to deal with. Cops hate dealing with these quality of life crimes. They hate dealing with it. They don't want to deal with a guy that's defecating in the street. They don't want to deal with the mentally ill person spitting and ranting and taking them to jail, and they don't know what to do with these people. So you have a system, a mental health or drug treatment system that is better for the individuals, and it's far better for all of us, because at least there's a chance of addressing the underlying problem.
You want to add anything, Chris?
I had a question. So, I live in Sunnyvale, heart of Silicon Valley, and you hear about the tech companies dedicating billions to the cause. But my question is, well, if you're going to dedicate billions, are they also going to require the city and the state to implement some of these ideas? It seems like the money should be used as a carrot, say, I've got the money, it's for you, but you first need to make some structural changes to how we support homelessness and housing before you get any of the money. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, no, actually precisely the opposite. I think the logic is difficult because of the political dynamics. So in Seattle and San Francisco, these are very progressive cities, and all of the energy is on the very far left. So for example, in Seattle, the bill passed this morning or yesterday afternoon to open 40 publicly funded tent cities in every corner of the city of Seattle, including residential neighborhoods. And it's a way of building political power and then also making homelessness visible to provide an evidence point for their narrative on inequality. And the problem is that the business community, and Seattle's the city I know best. I imagine there's kind of correlates in San Francisco and LA to a lesser extent. But the problem is that the business community has basically been caught flat-footed. If you're Jeff Bezos, it doesn't matter how much money you give, it's never going to be good enough. You're never going to placate the people who are the loudest and really in control of public policy in these very progressive West Coast cities. So the problem is that they have very little leverage, and they're outmatched politically at the city council level, at the mayoral level, even in the kind of city and county prosecutors. We're finding them being very kind of part of this progressive apparatus. So they have very little leverage, and I think the bigger problem is that these are folks who are running global companies. They're worried about a lot of things. They don't have the expertise, the staff, or really the interest in solving social problems. So what they do is, in many cases, it's delegated to a public policy team at someone like an Amazon or a Salesforce or an Oracle. And because they're operating in kind of exclusively Democratic environments, they hire former Democratic legislators and policy operators and lobbyists who are bought into those same ideological presuppositions that have created and sustained the problem in the first place. So you have in Seattle the kind of the thing that we want to like light your hair on fire, where you have people who are very sophisticated, kind of free market business people that are buying into and patting themselves on the back for permanent supportive housing, housing first. Well, all of these very smart people say housing first works. It's supported by the evidence. There's a report from the University of Washington. So you see money funneled into the exact same duplicates of the publicly funded programs. You're just kind of doubling down and in a perverse way creating the problem in an unintended consequence, actually creating more of the problem, and you're creating more of a power base, because encampments, social service bureaucracies, public sector unions are a power base, and right now they're growing. It's boom time business for these folks, and what you see is, just to give you one anecdote and one proud moment of victory I'd like to share with you. These are folks who are very ideological. So the King County, Washington, Seattle, King County, Homelessness Authority, the publicly funded agency, hosted a conference on the theme of decolonizing our collective work. This is kind of social justice theory, basically saying, how can we reduce white supremacy in how we administer homeless services? Kind of totally out there. But what they did is they made, and this is celebrated, right? You give an idea of the effectiveness of these folks, but they made one mistake. They hired a transgender woman to perform a strip show at the publicly funded conference. Video was leaked to me. I put it out. It was viewed 2 million times within a week on social media. It went to Fox News. It went to all the kind of right-of-center media outlets, and then the left-of-center and mainstream outlets. The executive director is fired. That's a big victory, I guess, accountability. And then people saying, that's great, you got accountability. But think of the mindset of people that think this is a good idea. And these are a room full of middle-aged, college and master's degree educated social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, caseworkers, and public administrators. And this is the thought pattern. Is this the kind of group of people you trust with your money? Unfortunately for the companies, there's nowhere else for them to put their money. And so you've kind of just flushing the system full of cash with no good ideas to implement.
We have some more.
I've always believed that the progressives' real goal is to get everybody on the plantation. Obama's famous video of the woman who throughout her whole life was taken care of by the government and just kept turning to the government. And so I don't think they're incented to solve the homeless problem because those people are as on the plantation as you can get. Would you care to comment about that? I think they're just invested in them.
Yeah, I'll briefly, and then, but yeah, and this really goes to the question of political power. This is a new power base in these cities. That's very clear. And one of the things that I found through some reporting and some investigative work is that at these publicly funded encampments in Seattle, again, the example that I'm most familiar with, you have hundreds of people that are living in publicly funded and nonprofit operated encampments. And they're low barrier, which is a euphemism for you can use drugs and alcohol. And what folks who are kind of formerly residents of this have told me is that you're required to earn participation credits by the nonprofit leadership. What's a participation credit? It's showing up at a city council meeting and matching t-shirts and shouting down anyone who has a contrary view. And it's basically showing up at all of these events and to support expanded funding for the nonprofits. So you're having essentially a cycle of very legitimately corruption, where the public sector is lobbying its counterparts in the city council with budgetary authority to keep cycling money through these programs. And they're incentivized to keep people, I might use a different metaphor than you, but I think they're excited, they're incentivized to keep people in the encampments. So these encampments, they have a rate of less than 4% at getting people out of the encampments and into housing. 96% of the time, people just stay. And they're permanently invested in the system. So I think you're absolutely right.
This is not quite to your point, but it brings up something Chris was saying. There's a group of people who don't want the homeless moved at all, and they have the ears of the politicians. I've said they treat them like they're an endangered species, and you can't touch them. You can't move them from their habitat whatsoever, and they have a lot of pull with politicians.
Yes, I'd like to ask the panel members, what do they think about the Haven of Hope project out of San Antonio, Texas?
A little bit, not enough to.
Okay,
I don't
so
know what
you
it
don't
is.
have any knowledge of that program or how it works?
I don't.
Okay.
Limited, yeah.
I mean, Chris, to your point about low barrier, Housing First promoting low barrier so-called solutions. One of the other things about the flip side of that is that the Housing First discriminates against high barrier programs, those that actually promote accountability, self-responsibility. So I wonder if you could talk about that, because I know here locally in Sacramento, there have been nonprofits that have been extremely successful, like St. John's program from Real Change, a women and children's shelter, but which do require self-accountability on the part of participants, and they've been discriminated against in terms of federal funding and local funding.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And luckily, I think that there's a possibility that this might change in the next year or 2 years, depending on how elections go. But at the federal level, HUD's mandate, their regulatory requirements, are that you let residents in permanent supportive housing use drugs and alcohol. You are disqualified if you say you need to be sober and in treatment to live here. It's very, I mean, I had to read it a couple times and talk to a couple people, say, am I reading this right? It's in bureaucratic language, but I think I understand this correctly. And there's an effort to change that, because the most effective groups, absolutely to your point, rescue missions and predominantly faith-based organizations have the best record at actually transforming lives. And there are folks who say, this is a disaster. How are you going to get someone to improve their life if they're in a housing unit with people that are living the same way of life? And I'm optimistic, though, that with some swamp fighting, that's the folks that I've been working with at HUD have been saying, we got in here with changes, and the swamp has won the first round, some of the permanent staff. But I think in the next year there might be some good changes on that.
Would you comment if there's a nexus on constitutional law and a clear and present danger, such as if this coronavirus hits an encampment and it gets out of control, or the plague or something? Do you foresee anything where there would be a health hazard to the general population that might put a curb on the constitutional law as interpreted now?
Yes. That I've been in the position to advise cities, so they're trying to figure out how to deal with this Martin decision. So if you have a health and safety problem, you can close the encampments, or you should have the power to close the encampments. A virus is one reason. I don't know how many coronavirus, but there's been outbreaks of hepatitis A in Los Angeles. There's warnings of a bubonic plague possibility in Los Angeles. Last time was in the 20s. A big issue is wildfires get started in homeless encampments. They happen all the time in Los Angeles. You have a fire in your tent. Tents are very flammable. You're out in nature. Crime, like a sufficiency of criminal activity. So yes, there is a nexus. Cities shouldn't be afraid to do something about that. But this problem they struggle with is when you don't have that. So I have a slightly different perspective on the. I have a slightly more charitable view about cities and their motivations. I mean, I've been advising dozens of cities, and they're struggling with this. They want to do something. It's costing politicians their jobs. There is a sort of movement to shore up a certain point of view. But this is a massive public health crisis, and there are a lot of officials that are working on this. So the answer is that if you have a public health crisis, it is constitutional to do something about it. So it's not that you can go around the Constitution, but the Constitution should be allow you to, protect the public.
We've got time for one more.
To the point that there are some people who don't want any change in this homeless thing, or just happy with it. I can attest to the fact that I really believe that. In my business, I run into many companies that need shelter, office space, warehouses, facilities. And in the city of San Francisco, there are several dozen, at least dozens, companies who are subcontracting from the city. So city officials don't want anything to do with this homeless problem. It's just a terrible thing, and everybody knows it. And the little pee-pee on the street is only half the issue. There's a much bigger issue than that. But there are some of these companies go around and scoop. That's what they do. And they get $1 million a year to scoop. Others deliver food. Others administer drug treatment. So these people, there are thousands of employees now making a living from, was well-meaning at first, but now money corrupts everything, right? And so the city is happy, they're happy. The homeless, the only people who aren't happy are the residents and the visitors. In other words, the citizens be damned. But so this is a real part of what's happened. It's metamorphosed into this issue now.
Yeah, people have identified that as the homeless industrial complex. Anybody want to touch on that? We have some closing remarks from Sally.
Well, once again, thank you all for coming, and many of you have been here all day, so you deserve a glass of wine, or another kind of drink at the back. We're having a little reception, and then I'm going to say a few remarks about my new book, and we'll sign copies. It's called False Premise, False Promise, The Disastrous Reality of Medicare for All, and as you know, tonight is the Nevada debate, so I think Medicare for All, Bernie Sanders versus the stepping stone other candidates will be very interesting. So thank you again, thank you to our panel, and I hope you can join us for a glass of wine or Coke.